Jason Hartwell's hands shook as he gripped the coffee shop door. 3 years. 3 years since his last date. And here he was, dragging his 6-year-old son into what should have been a careful return to romance. Tommy's Spider-Man backpack bumped against his leg as they stepped into Maple and Bean, the scent of roasted beans mixing with Jason's cold sweat. She sat at the corner table like she owned the place. Tailored grey blazer catching afternoon light, manicured fingers dancing across laptop keys with surgical precision. Everything about her screamed power, control, success. Everything about him screamed failure. "Sorry, I'm Jason," he stammered, approaching her sanctuary of sophistication. Tommy's small hand found his trembling one. "I know I shouldn't have brought him, but the babysitter cancelled and I—" Olivia looked up. Her expression should have been disgust, should have been the polite smile before a quick exit. Instead, something flickered behind those sharp eyes, hunger, recognition, something that made Jason's breath catch. She closed her laptop with deliberate slowness. "You know what?" she said, voice carrying an unexpected warmth that sent chills down his spine. "I think this might be exactly what I needed." Tommy climbed into the chair beside Olivia with the fearless confidence only children possessed, carefully arranging his backpack as if conducting a military operation. His small fingers smoothed imaginary wrinkles on his Iron Man t-shirt, then began organizing his colored pencils with the concentration of a scientist conducting critical research. Red, blue, yellow, green, each pencil placed with deliberate precision that made Olivia's breath catch in her throat. The same pattern, the exact same order her son Charlie had used every single day for 8 precious years. She watched every movement, memorizing the way his tongue poked out slightly when he concentrated on getting everything perfectly aligned. "Do you like order, Tommy?" she asked, voice softer than silk, barely above a whisper that carried decades of longing for exactly this kind of structured innocence. Tommy flashed a gap-toothed grin that could have powered the entire coffee shop, and probably half the downtown district. "Daddy says being neat is important," he replied with the earnest conviction of someone sharing profound wisdom. "He always cleans up before bedtime, even when he's super tired from work, and his eyes get all red and droopy like a sleepy turtle." The innocent honesty made Jason's neck flush with embarrassment, but when he looked at Olivia, her eyes held something that looked almost like respect, maybe even hunger for that kind of reliable structure. "I like discipline," she said, tilting her head in a way that suggested she saw far more than most people bothered to look for in everyday interactions. Not many parents teach their children that kind of structure anymore. It's becoming increasingly rare in today's world of instant gratification and participation trophies. Her voice carried a wistfulness that suggested personal experience with the consequences of chaos and lack of boundaries. The way she studied Tommy's methodical approach to organization spoke of someone who understood the comfort that could be found in predictable patterns and reliable routines. Jason noticed how her shoulders relaxed slightly as she watched his son's careful movements, as if witnessing something she'd thought was lost forever to modern parenting philosophies. The barista called out an order from behind the gleaming espresso machine, and Jason started to stand from his chair, muscle memory of 3 years of single parenting automatically kicking into gear. But Olivia was already moving toward the counter with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to taking charge of every situation she encountered, whether in corporate boardrooms or neighborhood coffee shops. Her heels clicked against the worn wooden floors, like a metronome keeping time with Jason's increasingly rapid heartbeat, each step precise and purposeful in a way that spoke of years spent walking through spaces where every movement carried weight and consequence. She moved through the crowded café with the kind of unconscious authority that made other customers step aside without realizing why they were doing so, creating a path through the morning rush as if she were royalty moving through her subjects. 3 hot chocolates with extra marshmallows for Tommy, she said to the barista without consulting the menu board, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question or hesitation. And an Americano, no sugar, extra shot. Jason stared at her, with his mouth slightly open in disbelief. How had she known his coffee preference from a 30-second interaction and a few nervous glances at the menu? The woman was either extraordinarily observant or had done her homework, and neither possibility felt particularly comforting given his complete lack of preparation for this encounter. "Business lunch habit?" Olivia explained with a dry humor that suggested years of experience reading people across conference tables and negotiating deals, where understanding your opponent's weaknesses could mean the difference between success and failure. She pulled out a platinum credit card that caught the afternoon light like liquid metal, the kind of financial instrument that came with private banking services and 24-hour concierge assistance for whatever emergencies might arise in the life of someone who could afford such luxuries. "I pay attention to details that most people miss. Coffee preferences, body language, micro-expressions. They tell you more about someone's character and reliability than most people realize, or would be comfortable admitting if they knew how much information they were broadcasting." The barista's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the card, recognizing it as the kind that required significant net worth and creditworthiness to obtain, probably wondering what someone of such obvious financial means was doing in their modest neighborhood establishment instead of the upscale bistros downtown where her economic peer group typically conducted their social activities. Tommy had begun the serious business of cooling his hot chocolate when their order arrived, blowing across the surface with the concentration of a scientist conducting a critical experiment that could determine the fate of nations. Steam rose from the cup in delicate spirals, and he watched them with the kind of fascination that only children could muster for simple phenomena that adults had long since learned to take for granted. Olivia mirrored his actions with surprising precision, earning a delighted giggle from Tommy that echoed through the café like church bells on a quiet Sunday morning, a sound so pure and infectious that it made several other patrons smile involuntarily as they were drawn into the innocent joy of a child discovering shared experience with a stranger who had taken the time to notice and participate in his simple ritual. The moment felt suspended in amber, precious and fragile, as if any sudden movement might shatter the unexpected connection forming between them over something as mundane as cooling beverages to optimal drinking temperature. "You're really cool, Miss Olivia," Tommy declared, with the kind of wholehearted enthusiasm that adults spent their entire lives trying to recapture through various forms of entertainment and distraction, foam already decorating his upper lip like a tiny white mustache that transformed his serious expression into something adorably comic. "Can you take a picture so I can show my teacher tomorrow? She says we should share good things that happen to us with the class during morning circle time, and meeting you is definitely a good thing." His request was delivered with such earnest sincerity that Jason felt his heart squeeze with pride at his son's ability to find joy in unexpected moments and include others in that happiness without reservation or calculation, Olivia pulled out her smartphone, sleek, expensive, probably worth more than Jason's monthly rent payment, and equipped with camera technology that rivaled professional equipment. She captured Tommy's marshmallow mustache with the careful attention of a portrait photographer, adjusting angles and considering lighting with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested this wasn't merely casual documentation, but rather the preservation of a moment she found genuinely precious. Her movements were precise and practiced, as if she'd done this countless times before under different circumstances, and Jason found himself wondering about the history behind such practiced tenderness in documenting childhood moments. "Perfect," she murmured, showing Tommy the result with something approaching genuine warmth in her voice, a quality that seemed to surprise her as much as it did Jason. But he noticed something else. The way her thumb lingered over the photo on the screen, the slight tremor that ran through her fingers as she looked at the image of Tommy's innocent joy, and the shadow that passed across her features like a cloud, briefly blocking the sun. There was a story there, written in the careful way she held the phone, as if it contained something both precious and painful, a reminder of experiences that had shaped her in ways that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. "He reminds me of someone," she said quietly. So quietly that Jason had to lean forward across the small table to catch the words that seemed to slip out without permission from whatever internal security system she maintained around her emotions and personal history. The admission seemed to surprise her, as if her usual corporate filter had momentarily malfunctioned and allowed genuine feeling to escape into the carefully controlled environment she worked so hard to maintain in all her interactions. Her voice carried a quality of vulnerability that contrasted sharply with the confident businesswoman who had been conducting phone calls and managing crises just moments before. "Who?" Tommy asked with the innocent curiosity that only children possessed, his head tilted at the same angle Olivia had used moments before, a mirror reflecting childhood wonder back at adult pain that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of professional competence and emotional armor. His question hung in the air with the kind of directness that cut through social niceties and polite conversations to reach the heart of things that mattered, demanding honesty that adults often struggled to provide even to themselves, let alone to children who deserved better than carefully constructed deflections designed to protect them from life's harsher realities. "Someone who was very important to me," Olivia whispered, her fingers unconsciously reaching toward Tommy's hair before catching herself and pulling back as if she'd almost touched a live wire that could electrocute her, with memories too painful to fully experience in a public setting. The gesture was so subtle that Jason almost missed it, but the longing in her eyes was unmistakable, the look of someone who had lost something irreplaceable and was struggling with the unexpected recognition of its echo in a stranger's child. "A little boy who loved marshmallows just like you do," she continued, her voice taking on a quality that suggested she was speaking more to herself than to them. "He used to make mustaches too, and laugh when they'd fall into his cocoa and make a mess of his shirt that I'd have to clean later, but I never minded because his joy was worth any amount of extra laundry." The pain in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, carved into the careful lines around her eyes and the way she held herself like someone protecting an old wound from fresh air that might cause it to reopen and bleed all over the pristine table between them. Jason caught the slight tremor in her hands as she set down her coffee cup, knuckles gone white with the effort of maintaining control over emotions that threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed composure. There was clearly a story there, a deep one written in the way she avoided looking directly at Tommy for extended periods, as if too much exposure to his innocent presence might trigger something she wasn't prepared to handle in such a public setting. Before Jason could formulate a gentle question that might encourage her to share more without pushing too hard against obvious boundaries, Olivia's phone buzzed against the table like an angry wasp trapped in amber, its urgent vibration cutting through the intimate atmosphere they'd created and threatening to shatter the fragile connection forming between them over shared hot chocolate and childhood wonder. The screen lit up with "Regional Director" displayed in bold letters, followed by what looked like the beginning of a very urgent message that threatened to drag her back into the corporate world from which she'd been trying to escape for the past 30 minutes. She glanced at the phone with obvious reluctance, then at Tommy, who was carefully constructing a small architectural marvel out of his remaining marshmallows, building what appeared to be a miniature castle complete with towers and defensive walls, then back at the device that represented obligations and responsibilities that had nothing to do with the simple pleasure of watching a child play with his food. It was a look that suggested internal calculation of the kind that most people never had to make in their daily lives, weighing priorities that existed on completely different scales of importance and urgency corporate responsibilities that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue against the simple human pleasure of sharing an unexpected moment of connection with a single father and his son, who had somehow managed to slip past her usual defenses and remind her of experiences she thought she'd successfully buried beneath layers of professional achievement and financial success. "Excuse me for just a moment," she said, rising from her chair with the reluctant efficiency of someone who had spent years putting business obligations before everything else, even when everything else might be exactly what she needed most for her emotional and psychological well-being. "This might be important, but I promise I'll be right back." Her voice carried an apology that seemed directed as much at herself as at them, as if she were disappointed in her inability to fully disconnect from the demands that followed her, even into spaces that should have been sanctuaries from corporate warfare and strategic planning sessions. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the busy street, Jason watched Olivia pace back and forth on the sidewalk like a caged predator, her entire demeanor undergoing a complete transformation as she slipped back into whatever role the phone call demanded from her professional persona. Her free hand moved in sharp, decisive gestures that suggested she was giving orders rather than receiving them, and her posture had shifted from the relaxed woman sharing hot chocolate and childhood memories into someone who could reshape corporate landscapes with a few carefully chosen words delivered with the right combination of authority and strategic precision. The conversation appeared intense, based on the way her jaw tightened and her shoulders squared against whatever resistance she was encountering on the other end of the line, her expression cycling through various degrees of frustration and determination as she worked to resolve whatever crisis had interrupted their carefully orchestrated morning together. Even from inside the café, Jason could see the change in how she commanded the space around her. Passing pedestrians instinctively gave her a wider berth, recognizing some indefinable quality of authority, even when they couldn't hear her voice or understand the context of her obviously important discussion with someone who clearly needed immediate guidance or correction. She dominated the sidewalk like it was her personal boardroom, turning a public space into her temporary office through sheer force of personality and the kind of unconscious entitlement that came from years of having her words carry weight in rooms where decisions worth millions of dollars were made before lunch and implemented before dinner. "Daddy, she looks like a boss lady from the TV shows you watch after I go to bed." Tommy observed with the brutal honesty that made Jason want to crawl under the nearest table and disappear into the floor until the embarrassment passed and normal conversation could resume. The kid wasn't wrong in his assessment. Everything about Olivia's phone posture screamed executive power and corporate authority, from the way she held her device like a weapon capable of destroying careers with a single well-placed call, to the manner in which she controlled the pedestrian traffic flow around her, as if it belonged to her by right rather than by chance. When she returned to their table 5 minutes later, her entire demeanor had shifted completely, like watching a skilled actor change costumes and personas between scenes in a complex play where each character required different vocal patterns and body language to convey their unique role in the unfolding drama. The warm, slightly vulnerable woman who had photographed Tommy's marshmallow mustache and shared fragments of painful memories had been replaced by someone who could have stepped directly off the cover of Fortune magazine, all sharp edges and calculated efficiency, designed to intimidate competitors and inspire confidence in shareholders who measured success in quarterly earnings reports and annual growth percentages. Her transformation was so complete that Jason found himself wondering if he'd imagined the earlier moments of genuine human connection, or if they'd been part of some elaborate performance designed to achieve goals he couldn't begin to understand or anticipate. "Work emergency," she explained with the kind of crisp professionalism that could have frozen coffee at 30 paces, already closing her laptop with movements that spoke of 1,000 similar departures over the years. Moments when business obligations had forced her to abandon personal interests and human connections in favor of corporate responsibilities that demanded immediate attention regardless of timing or circumstances. Her fingers moved with mechanical efficiency across the device, disconnecting chargers and organizing papers with the kind of practiced speed that suggested this routine was painfully familiar to her. A well-rehearsed dance of prioritization that always ended with work winning over personal fulfillment. "They need me for an emergency conference call with our Hong Kong office in 15 minutes, she continued, her voice taking on the flat, emotionless quality that executives learned to deploy when delivering news that disappointed everyone involved but couldn't be changed due to forces beyond anyone's immediate control. "There's a multi-million-dollar deal that's threatening to fall apart because of time zone complications and cultural misunderstandings that require my personal intervention to resolve before our competitors realize what's happening and attempt to steal our clients with better offers and more flexible terms." The explanation was delivered with the efficiency of someone accustomed to justifying her absence to people who might not understand the complexities of international business or the responsibilities that came with her level of corporate authority. She trailed off mid-sentence, her gaze falling on Tommy's face as it transformed from excitement to the kind of devastation that only came from having Christmas morning unexpectedly cancelled due to circumstances beyond a 6-year-old's comprehension or control. His small shoulders slumped forward, and he looked down at his half-finished hot chocolate as if the beverage had somehow personally betrayed him by not being magical enough to prevent the adult world from intruding on their perfect morning together. The sight of his disappointment seemed to hit Olivia like a physical blow, her corporate mask slipping just enough to reveal the genuine regret she felt about having to choose between professional obligations and the simple pleasure of continuing to build whatever connection was forming between them. "You have to go!" Tommy's voice carried all the heartbreak of a child who had just discovered that adults had responsibilities and priorities that didn't always align with making children happy. His question delivered with the kind of innocent hope that suggested he still believed that if he asked nicely enough, the situation might somehow change in their favor. his small hands wrapped around his cup, as if the warmth might provide some comfort against the cold reality of abandonment by yet another adult who had briefly entered his life, only to be pulled away by forces he couldn't understand or influence through good behavior or earnest requests for their continued presence. Jason felt his heart crack a little more as he watched his son process this latest disappointment, a reminder of exactly why he'd spent 3 years carefully avoiding situations like this one. Every connection Tommy made with potential maternal figures became another opportunity for abandonment, another lesson in the harsh reality that people had lives and priorities that didn't include 2-person families living in studio apartments furnished with second-hand furniture and dreams that felt too big for their modest circumstances. This was the inevitable result of allowing hope to override practical considerations about compatibility and long-term viability of relationships that crossed economic and social boundaries. But something unexpected happened in the silence that followed Tommy's question. Olivia paused with her laptop halfway into her designer bag, studying his crestfallen expression with an intensity that made the air between them crackle like electricity building before a thunderstorm that could either bring refreshing rain or destructive lightning depending on atmospheric conditions beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. Jason could practically see the internal battle playing out behind her carefully composed features, duty versus desire, corporate responsibility versus the kind of simple human connection she'd probably forgotten existed in her world of strategic planning sessions and quarterly earnings reports. The café continued its normal weekend rhythm around them, conversations in multiple languages blending with the steady hiss of the espresso machine and the gentle clink of ceramic cups against saucers. But their small table had become an island of suspended decision-making, where the next few words could determine whether this unexpected encounter would end with polite goodbyes and forgotten phone numbers, or evolve into something more substantial and potentially life-changing for all 3 of them. Tommy continued staring at his hot chocolate, occasionally glancing up at Olivia with the kind of hope that only children possessed, the belief that adults could change their minds if the situation was important enough and the request was delivered with sufficient sincerity. "Actually," she said slowly, each word carefully chosen, as if she were negotiating the most important contract of her career, rather than simply deciding whether to extend a coffee shop conversation by 30 minutes. "They can wait. Hong Kong has been conducting international business for thousands of years. I'm sure they can survive another half hour without my input on cultural sensitivity and negotiation strategies." Her decision to settle back into her chair seemed to surprise her as much as it did Jason, as if she'd just made an unprecedented choice that went against every professional instinct she'd developed over decades of climbing corporate ladders and meeting shareholder expectations. The smile that spread across Tommy's face was like watching the sun emerge from behind storm clouds, transforming his features from dejected disappointment into pure, radiant joy that could have powered the entire coffee shop and probably several neighboring businesses as well. "Really? You're going to stay? Can you do magic tricks like the man at my birthday party last year who made coins disappear and pulled flowers out of his sleeves?" His excitement was infectious, bouncing slightly in his seat with the kind of barely contained energy that threatened to launch him into orbit if not properly channeled into constructive activities that could harness his enthusiasm without causing property damage or disturbing other customers. His joy was so pure and uncomplicated that it made other people in the coffee shop turn their heads and smile involuntarily as they witnessed the kind of unfiltered happiness that reminded them of their own childhoods and simpler times when the promise of magic tricks from a friendly stranger was enough to transform an ordinary morning into an adventure worthy of detailed retelling to friends and family members who might not fully appreciate the significance of such small miracles, but would listen politely because they loved the storyteller enough to share in their enthusiasm. Olivia's response was to produce the first genuinely warm smile Jason had seen cross her features since they'd been introduced, a transformation that softened the sharp angles of her face and revealed glimpses of the woman who existed beneath layers of corporate armor and professional competence. "I might know a few simple tricks," she said, with the kind of conspiratorial humor that suggested hidden depths beneath her polished exterior, reaching across the table for her business card, with fingers that moved like those of a concert pianist approaching familiar keys with the confidence that came from years of practice and muscle memory developed through countless repetitions of precise movements. The cardstock was thick and expensive, the kind that announced importance through texture alone before anyone even bothered to read the words embossed on its surface in gold lettering that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows and reflected it back like small mirrors designed to impress clients and competitors with subtle displays of wealth and attention to detail that spoke of companies where every element of corporate identity was carefully crafted to convey messages about stability, success, and the kind of attention to quality that justified premium pricing for services and products. She began folding the business card with precise creases that transformed corporate identity into art, each manipulation of the expensive paper calculated to achieve specific geometric results that would ultimately create something beautiful from something purely functional. Her movements held the kind of meditative quality that spoke of someone who had learned to find peace and center herself through small, controllable actions when everything else in her world felt chaotic and unpredictable. A coping mechanism developed through years of high-stress situations where maintaining composure could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure in negotiations where millions of dollars hung in the balance. The transformation was mesmerizing to watch, like witnessing mathematics become poetry through the simple application of pressure applied at exactly the right angles and in precisely the correct sequence to achieve the desired outcome. Her fingers worked with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't her first attempt at origami, making Jason wonder when and how a corporate executive had found time to develop such an unexpected skill, and what circumstances had led her to seek solace in the ancient art of paper folding that required patience and precision, rather than the aggressive tactics typically associated with hostile business takeovers and corporate expansion strategies. When she handed Tommy the completed paper crane, Jason glimpsed the embossed text before his son's eager fingers closed around it, like he was receiving treasure from a fairy tale, where ordinary objects possessed magical properties and could grant wishes to those pure enough of heart to believe in possibilities that adults had long since dismissed as impossible. Olivia Walsh, CEO, Walsh Enterprises. The name hit his consciousness like a freight train carrying a cargo of impossibility, each letter resonating through his awareness, with implications that made his previous nervousness seem quaint by comparison. The recognition was immediate and devastating. Walsh Enterprises was the multinational conglomerate that owned half of Iowa's agricultural production facilities, maintained enough political influence to make senators return phone calls within minutes rather than days, and generated more revenue in a single fiscal quarter than Jason would see in multiple lifetimes of 40-hour work weeks, combined with careful budgeting and strategic coupon usage. The woman sitting across from him, sharing hot chocolate with his 6-year-old son, and folding origami birds from business cards worth more than his monthly rent, could probably purchase his entire neighborhood before lunch and still have sufficient funds remaining to buy several more neighborhoods as investment properties or charitable donations, depending on her mood and tax planning strategies. 2 weeks crawled by with the agonizing slowness of dental work, performed without adequate anesthesia or entertainment to distract from the discomfort. Each day bringing text messages that felt like small miracles landing in Jason's increasingly mundane world of spreadsheet analysis and client management responsibilities that seemed trivial compared to the international business dealings he now knew Olivia handled on a daily basis. These weren't the typical dating app conversations he'd heard his co-workers complaining about during lunch breaks, exchanges filled with inappropriate emoji usage and sexual innuendo that made committed relationships seem impossible to achieve in the modern dating landscape, dominated by hookup culture and commitment phobia. Instead, Olivia sent thoughtful questions about Tommy's latest Lego architectural achievements, sharing detailed photographs of books that reminded her of bedtime stories she thought he might enjoy, and forwarding memes that actually made Jason laugh out loud in the break room at Miller and Associates rather than the forced chuckles he usually produced when co-workers shared internet humor that seemed designed more to fill awkward silences than to generate genuine amusement through clever observations about shared human experiences. Her messages arrived at perfectly timed intervals throughout his workday, as if she'd studied his schedule and determined the optimal moments when a friendly text might provide maximum emotional benefit without interfering with his professional responsibilities. The sudden transformation in his demeanor hadn't gone unnoticed by his colleagues, who had grown accustomed to his perpetually serious approach to office interactions and careful attention to work-related conversations that never strayed into personal territory or revealed anything about his life outside the beige cubicle walls that defined his professional existence. Rebecca from the accounting department had started giving him strange looks when his phone buzzed during their weekly budget meetings, probably wondering why their most reliable and predictable colleague had suddenly developed what appeared to be a case of romantic optimism that manifested in spontaneous smiling and occasional distraction from financial reports that usually commanded his complete attention. "You're different lately," she'd observed during their Thursday lunch at the break room table that wobbled slightly due to uneven legs that facilities management had been promising to repair for the past 18 months, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex mathematical equation that involved variables she couldn't identify or quantify. Lighter somehow, like someone finally gave you permission to be happy for the first time since I've known you, which is saying something considering we've worked together for over 2 years and I've seen you smile maybe 3 times total. And 2 of those were when Tommy drew you pictures that you keep in your desk drawer. The observation had stuck with him throughout the remainder of the work week, mainly because he couldn't remember the last time anyone had accused him of exhibiting signs of happiness about anything more substantial than successfully completing quarterly tax returns ahead of schedule or finding a parking space close to the office entrance during the morning rush, when such conveniences felt like minor victories against the daily obstacles that made urban life more challenging than necessary. The realization that his emotional state had become transparent enough for casual observers to notice and comment upon was both encouraging and slightly alarming, suggesting that his carefully maintained professional demeanor was less effective at concealing personal developments than he'd previously believed. Friday afternoon brought an invitation that made his palms produce enough nervous perspiration to require discreet wiping on his trouser legs before he could compose a response that wouldn't reveal the extent of his anxiety about the proposed activity. Art museum this weekend? Tommy might enjoy the interactive section. They have a kinetic sculpture exhibit that's supposed to be fascinating for children who like to understand how mechanical systems work and create visual beauty through motion and engineering principles. Oh? The casual tone of her message couldn't disguise the fact that she was essentially asking him to enter a world he'd never belonged to. Among people who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about artistic movements he'd never heard of, and paid more for individual pieces than he earned in fiscal years. The Cedar Falls Museum of Art stood like a temple to cultural refinement that Jason had driven past countless times during his daily commute, but had never seriously considered entering. Its marble steps and imposing neoclassical columns suggesting the kind of intellectual sophistication that required more than his state university education and Walmart wardrobe could provide in terms of preparation or appropriate attire. The building itself seemed to whisper subtle warnings about the kind of people who belonged within its hallowed halls, individuals with advanced degrees in subjects that didn't immediately translate into practical career opportunities, wine collections that required climate-controlled storage, and informed opinions about the intersection of politics with artistic expression that could sustain dinner-party conversations for hours without reaching definitive conclusions. The $15 admission fee represented his carefully budgeted coffee allowance for the entire week, a stark reminder of exactly how different their financial realities were when measured in practical terms, rather than the romantic idealism that had been clouding his judgment since their initial meeting at the coffee shop. But Olivia had already purchased their tickets with the casual ease of someone for whom such expenses barely registered as line items in monthly budgets that probably included categories for things like private jet maintenance and charity donations that exceeded most people's annual salaries. Another reminder of the vast economic chasm that separated their daily lived experiences from each other. Tommy pressed his nose against every glass case, with the enthusiasm of a young scientist encountering laboratory equipment for the first time, his breath fogging the protective barriers as he studied sculptures that carried insurance policies worth more than Jason's gross annual income and probably required special environmental controls to prevent deterioration from exposure to normal atmospheric conditions. His son's wonder was infectious, transforming the sterile gallery spaces into a playground of discovery, where dragons crafted from bronze seemed to breathe with life and marble heroes posed in eternal moments of triumph and tragedy that spoke to universal human experiences across centuries of artistic expression and cultural evolution. The transformation in Tommy's perspective reminded Jason of why he'd agreed to this excursion, despite his reservations about entering spaces where his economic background might be obvious to trained observers who could read social cues in clothing choices and conversation patterns. Watching his son discover beauty and meaning in objects created by artists who'd been dead for decades or centuries provided a kind of vicarious education that felt valuable enough to justify the temporary discomfort of feeling out of place among patrons who belonged in such refined environments through birth, education, or financial achievement, rather than curiosity and parental dedication to expanding a child's cultural horizons. You're holding tension in your shoulders like you're expecting someone to ask for credentials that prove you belong here, Olivia observed, moving closer until Jason could detect the subtle fragrance of her perfume, something expensive and complex that probably carried a French name and cost more than his monthly rent payment, chosen by consultants who understood how scent could communicate status and sophistication to those educated enough to recognize the difference between department store offerings and custom blends created specifically for individuals who could afford such personalized luxury services. "I don't bite," she added with the kind of dry humor that suggested years of experience dealing with people who found her presence intimidating, for various reasons related to her obvious financial success and corporate authority. "Unless you're a competitor attempting corporate espionage, in which case all bets are off and my legal team has instructions to pursue maximum penalties allowed under current intellectual property protection statutes." The joke was delivered with enough sincerity to make Jason wonder whether she was entirely kidding about the legal team part, given what he now knew about her position in the business world and the kinds of industrial secrets that might require protection from corporate rivals. "It's just surreal being here with you," he admitted, gesturing vaguely at the refined space around them with its carefully controlled lighting and hushed atmosphere of reverent appreciation for artistic achievement that spanned multiple centuries and cultural traditions. "You could be anywhere in the world right now, Paris, London, Tokyo, wherever people with your resources typically spend their weekend leisure time. Private galleries, exclusive exhibitions, artist studios where you could commission original works that would never be seen by general public audiences." His voice carried self-deprecating humor that couldn't quite mask the genuine bewilderment he felt about their unlikely pairing and her apparent interest in spending time with someone whose cultural sophistication had been acquired primarily through public library visits and educational television programming. "You could be with anyone who actually belongs in spaces like this," he continued, words tumbling out faster than his internal editor could review them for potential embarrassment or social inappropriateness. "People who can discuss the influence of post-impressionism on contemporary sculpture, and wine pairings that enhance appreciation for specific artistic periods, without requiring reference materials or discreet consultation with museum guides, who probably assume I'm lost and looking for the gift shop or restroom facilities." The admission revealed more about his insecurity than he'd intended, but once the words were released into the space between them, there was no retrieving them or pretending he felt more confident about his presence in such rarefied cultural atmosphere. The question that had been bothering him since their coffee shop encounter finally escaped before he could consider its potential consequences. Why choose the single dad with the complicated package deal who thinks Monet might be something you pay monthly rent with, rather than a revolutionary artist who changed how people perceive light and color in representational painting? The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, brutally honest about his educational limitations and the mathematical impossibility of their relationship progressing beyond casual acquaintance, given their incompatible backgrounds and social circumstances that no amount of good intentions could overcome through wishful thinking alone. The words had barely finished leaving his mouth when Jason realized he'd made a crucial tactical error in judgment that could end their fragile connection before it had a chance to develop into something more substantial. Olivia's expression underwent a dramatic transformation. Storm clouds gathering behind those sharp eyes in a way that reminded him of weather patterns he'd observed from his apartment windows, the kind of atmospheric pressure changes that preceded severe thunderstorms capable of causing significant property damage and power outages that could last for days, depending on the severity of the meteorological disturbance and the preparedness of local utility companies. "Don't make assumptions about what I want or why I'm here, Jason," she said, with ice in her voice that could have frozen the hot chocolate they'd shared 2 weeks earlier, during what now felt like a different lifetime entirely, her tone carrying the kind of controlled fury that probably made corporate executives reconsider their career choices during hostile board meetings, where quarterly projections failed to meet shareholder expectations and heads rolled with the efficiency of guillotines during historical periods of social upheaval. You don't know anything about what brought me to that coffee shop, what I was searching for when I swiped right on your dating profile instead of the dozens of messages I receive weekly from senators and celebrities who assume financial success automatically translates into romantic availability. The temperature in the gallery seemed to drop by at least 10 degrees, and nearby visitors unconsciously moved away from their location, as if sensing the sudden tension crackling between them like static electricity before lightning strikes that could potentially damage sensitive electronic equipment or cause injury to anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in the wrong place when atmospheric conditions became dangerous. Several museum patrons glanced in their direction with the kind of polite concern that suggested they were debating whether to alert security personnel about a potential domestic disturbance that might require intervention to protect valuable artwork from collateral damage if the situation escalated beyond verbal disagreement into physical confrontation. "I'm not assuming anything." Jason started to protest, but she cut him off with a look that could have sliced through reinforced steel and left edges so clean they could be used for precision manufacturing applications that required the tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, except maybe that someone in your position would naturally prefer companionship from social and economic equals rather than charity cases who need financial assistance to afford museum admission fees. But his attempt at clarification only seemed to fan the flames of her indignation, transforming what might have been a minor misunderstanding into a conflict that threatened to destroy any possibility of future interaction between them. "Yes, you are making assumptions," she continued with increasing intensity, her voice carrying years of frustration with people who reduced her to a caricature based on net worth rather than recognizing her as a complex individual with genuine emotions and psychological needs that couldn't be satisfied through material acquisitions or corporate achievements that impressed business magazines, but did nothing to address fundamental human requirements for connection and understanding. "You're assuming that because I have money, because I run a multinational corporation, because I can afford museum memberships and expensive coffee without checking my account balance first, that I must be looking for someone who fits some predetermined mold created by society magazines and romantic comedies written by people who've never actually experienced the isolation that comes with financial success, that separates you from normal human interactions and genuine relationships." Her words carried the weight of personal experience with the kinds of social dynamics that Jason had never had to navigate, revealing glimpses of a world where wealth created its own problems and barriers to authentic connection that were perhaps even more challenging than the obstacles faced by those struggling with financial limitations and economic uncertainty. The realization that extreme financial success might create its own form of loneliness was something he'd never seriously considered, having been too focused on his own challenges with making ends meet and providing adequately for Tommy's needs to contemplate the psychological costs that might accompany the kind of corporate achievement that Olivia had obviously attained through years of strategic planning and professional sacrifice. Tommy chose that precise moment to barrel into their increasingly heated conversation with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever who had just discovered that tennis balls existed and were apparently designed specifically for his entertainment and physical exercise needs, completely oblivious to the adult emotional drama that was unfolding around him, like a soap opera being broadcast in real time to an audience of museum patrons who had expected to spend their Saturday afternoon contemplating artistic beauty rather than witnessing relationship conflicts between people whose economic circumstances were obviously incompatible with long-term romantic success. He wrapped his small arms around Jason's legs with the kind of uninhibited physical affection that only children could display without worrying about social appropriateness or the potential for rejection from recipients who might be too distracted by other concerns to properly appreciate such spontaneous demonstrations of love and trust. In his hands, he clutched a stuffed elephant that was clearly museum-quality merchandise soft grey fabric that felt like it had been crafted by artisans who understood the importance of tactile experiences in childhood development, kind eyes that seemed almost alive with personality and warmth, and construction details that spoke of manufacturing processes that prioritized durability and safety over profit margins and cost reduction strategies. The price tag, when Jason glimpsed it over Tommy's shoulder as his son displayed his treasure with obvious pride and excitement, showed $35 in clear numerical digits that might as well have been written in neon lights for all the subtle impact they had on his awareness of their financial disparities. $35 represented more money than he typically allocated for grocery purchases during an entire week of careful meal planning and strategic use of store coupons, combined with generic brand selections that sacrificed variety and sometimes quality in favor of affordability and budget adherence that allowed him to maintain basic nutritional standards for both himself and Tommy without accumulating additional debt or falling behind on other essential expenses like rent and utilities. "Look what Miss Olivia bought for me, Daddy." Tommy's excitement was so infectious and pure that it temporarily cut through the tension between the adults like a knife through softened butter, his joy completely uncomplicated by awareness of the economic implications of such a generous gift, or the potential awkwardness it might create between people who were still negotiating the boundaries and expectations of their developing relationship. She said elephants are good luck, and that this one will help me remember that some grown-ups care about kids even when they don't have to, which I think means she likes me, even though I'm not her actual son, and she doesn't get any parent points for being nice to me at museums and coffee shops. The innocent interpretation of adult motivations and the guileless acceptance of kindness from relative strangers reminded Jason of everything he loved about his son's perspective on the world. But it also intensified his discomfort with accepting what amounted to charity from someone whose casual spending power exceeded his carefully managed budget for non-essential purchases by several orders of magnitude. "Tommy, we can't accept gifts like this," he started, the words feeling like swallowing broken glass, mixed with his pride and whatever remained of his dignity after their conversation about social compatibility and economic realities that couldn't be overcome through good intentions and mutual attraction alone. "It's too expensive, and we haven't done anything to earn such generosity from someone we barely know, despite the pleasant conversation and shared hot chocolate experience that was definitely enjoyable but doesn't create obligations or expectations for future gift exchanges that exceed our to reciprocate with items of comparable value." But before he could complete his polite refusal and suggest alternative ways that Tommy could express appreciation without accepting charity that would create awkward imbalances in their developing social dynamic, Olivia held up a perfectly manicured hand with the kind of authority that made board members reconsider their quarterly projections and senators return phone calls within minutes rather than days. Friends buy gifts for each other," she said with quiet intensity, putting deliberate and unmistakable emphasis on the word friends in a way that felt like a door slamming shut between them with the finality of a bank vault closing on his romantic aspirations and foolish hopes for developing something more meaningful than casual acquaintance with someone whose social status and financial resources placed her in a completely different category of potential romantic partners than anything he should realistically consider pursuing, given his limited resources and complicated family situation that required careful budgeting and long-term planning for basic stability, rather than the kind of spontaneous luxury that characterized her approach to gift-giving and social interaction. The casual dismissal of any romantic possibility stung worse than a physical slap would have, reminding Jason with brutal clarity exactly where he stood in the hierarchy of her social world. Not potential romantic partner worthy of serious consideration for long-term relationship development, not even interesting acquaintance who might provide intellectual stimulation or emotional connection worth maintaining beyond a few casual encounters, but simply friend, a word that felt like a consolation prize wrapped in expensive paper and tied with ribbons that probably cost more than his monthly transportation budget, including gas, insurance, and vehicle maintenance expenses that required careful planning to manage within his limited financial resources. The elephant in Tommy's arms seemed to mock him with its $35 price tag that represented the casual nature of her generosity toward people she considered friends, while simultaneously highlighting the impossibility of his reciprocating with gifts of comparable value that would demonstrate equal investment in their relationship and maintain the kind of social balance that allowed people from different economic circumstances to interact without the constant reminder of financial disparities that made genuine friendship challenging to maintain over time, when every social interaction involved calculations about who could afford what and whether accepting or declining invitations might create awkwardness or resentment.